In this video, we will be making a bird's eye aerial perspective rendering using SketchUp, Lumion, and Photoshop. Our goal is to avoid using Photoshop as much as possible. We'll add a few things in with it, but primarily we're going to be making the final drawing just using Lumion. So we'll start with a SketchUp model, and probably the biggest difference between making a line drawing and a rendering using Lumion or whatever rendering software you want to use, the most important thing becomes your materials inside of your 3D model, especially with Lumion, because once we import into Lumion, we're going to be applying materials. And if we don't have correct materials assigned in SketchUp, then that's going to cause us some issues. You don't necessarily have to have like the actual correct material applied in SketchUp. All that matters is that whatever you want to materialize in Lumion, it needs to be separated in SketchUp because Lumion clumps together all the same materials. It's not by object, it's by material. The next thing you have to understand is that we want to actually have some sort of 3D geometry for almost every single edge in our drawing. If you're doing an Illustrator drawing, just straight up lines in SketchUp will actually transfer over to Illustrator. But this, we actually want some sort of 3D geometry. So here you can see on this roof, I'm literally changing the edges or the lines of the roof geometry to pipes. I'm just using this extension called JHS Power Bar that has a lines to pipes option. And the reason why I'm doing this is because these lines aren't going to transfer into Lumion, but these 3D pipes, even though like they're going to be very, very small and subtle, you're still going to pick up that edge of that roof versus if you just have the line in SketchUp, it's just going to be invisible. And here I just wanted to show you the technique I was using to add street lines. Once again, this is another detail that you probably wouldn't have to do if you're going into Illustrator, but because we're taking it straight into Lumion, I want there to be actual street lines. So to do this, I'm just using the lines that I would have for Illustrator, and I'm just using another tool in the JHS Power Bar that creates a rectangular extrusion along that path. And very quickly, I can make those road lines have thickness. All in all, just understand that if you're trying to make a line drawing versus a rendering, both of those 3D models are going to require different levels of detail and attention in specific areas. So now we're ready to put our model into Lumion. To do this, we'll open up Lumion and just choose a default level. And for this tutorial, we're going to use the Live Sync extension in SketchUp to load our model directly into Lumion. So if we hit play on the Live Sync toolbar in SketchUp, you'll see that it'll automatically load and sync our SketchUp model into the Lumion render window. And now you can see it's synced up with our SketchUp model. So as you move around in SketchUp, it'll automatically update the view in Lumion. This isn't the only way to import your model into Lumion. You can also click Import and then select your 3D model file. You can actually just use a SketchUp model file, and then it'll let you import that directly into Lumion. Both ways of importing models have their own plus and minuses, but obviously if you're doing the live sync, as you model in your SketchUp or whatever file you're using, it's going to automatically update in Lumion, which is a really cool feature. So the first thing I want to do in Lumion is set up my camera view for my aerial render. So I'll click the camera icon in the bottom right-hand corner of Lumion, and this will take you to your scene editor, which is where you'll be exporting and adding effects to your final renders. So the first thing I want to do to my camera is adjust the focal length of my camera lens. The default is a pretty wide angle, so I'm increasing it quite a bit because I want to get closer to a true isometric view. So once you get the camera view that you want, you can click the Store Camera icon above your scene, and that's just going to save the view. So if you ever need to get back to it, you can just click on it. Now that we have our scene saved, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick rendering, and I just want to do this so that we can see the before and after without adding any materials, any effects, and any post-processing in Photoshop. Now we can start applying materials. So to do this, we'll go back to the build window by clicking the build icon in the bottom right-hand corner. And then if I click on the materials tab, it'll bring up my material editor. And you can see now, as I hover over different materials that I assign in SketchUp, it highlights them as being the same material in Lumion. So applying materials in Lumion is extremely straightforward and simple. You have tons of different options. That's probably one of the best things about Lumion, are all the built-in material sets that you can use. Everything from 3D grass to wet concrete to whatever type of metal that you need. It's all in there, and it really allows you to have a very quick and efficient workflow. And every material that you apply actually has an extended set of properties and adjustments that you can make. For example, here I wanted to make this concrete a little bit lighter. So I used the colorization tool with my color set on white, and I just increase it, make it a little bit brighter. And then here you also have cool options like adding a weathering effect that makes the concrete look like it's a little bit more worn out. And here you can see me just using that same concrete material that I just applied and copying it and pasting it into my other concrete materials, and then just adjusting that colorization effect because I want some to read darker and some to read lighter. And now I'm just gonna really speed this up because obviously probably the longest part of this whole process is going to be applying materials. But like I said, because all the materials are built in, it's probably going to be one of the most efficient rendering tools in terms of applying materials. And there are tons of great resources and tutorials for making Lumion materials and adjusting them to get them to be exactly how you need them to be for your rendering. But just like anything else, the more times you use this program, the better you're going to get at applying materials quickly and making them look exactly how you want. And just like any other drawing, it's important to understand what you're looking for in terms of final output. So for this aerial view, you might not have to spend as much time in the detail in the materials because you're going to be so far zoomed out that you might even be able to see it. So here is an example of when you have two materials on the same plane. You get something called Z-fiding, where it doesn't know which material that should be showing through. So to fix this, in the material settings, you can actually reduce the flicker reduction, and that'll override one material over the other. It's a really helpful tip, actually. But ideally, you want to avoid having two materials on the same plane in whatever your 3D modeling program is. So here I realized that I wanted this garden bed pattern to actually be going lengthwise in those center garden beds. So in order to fix this, I needed to go back into my SketchUp model, which you can see me doing here, and actually change the material of those center garden beds so that it's different than the garden beds on the sides, so that I can actually apply a new material to those beds and rotate it so that the pattern is going lengthwise. So you can see here I'm in SketchUp, and I'm literally just going to apply a pink material just to separate it and to make it very obvious. So once I go back into my Lumion, you can see, because I'm live synced, it automatically loads in. And now you have two different materials. You have that pink material, and then you have that farm material. So on the pink material, I'm just going to copy and paste the same farm material. But now, because it's a separate material from SketchUp, I can adjust, I can rotate that garden bed material, and it's not going to affect the other ones I already placed. Once you get the process down for applying materials in Lumion, you'll find that's actually really fun. And really, the more time you spend putting the materials in, the better your final output's going to be. But you also don't want to get too bogged down. Just like you could in Illustrator, playing with line work, it's the same for Lumion when it comes to materials. So I think I have pretty much all my materials where I want them to be. I know I want to do kind of a sunset rendering or kind of a later in the day. So I go ahead and choose my weather tab in my build window, and I can lower the sun angle just to start to get a closer feel to what it's going to be like when I render it. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and render out a test shot with that lower lighting. And this is a habit you want to get into whenever you're using Lumion. As much as possible, you want to export renders because Lumion is going to calculate some things that it might not in the real-time viewer that you need to see as you're applying the effects. So now we're going to start adding our own effects to this drawing. So the first thing that I like to do for an aerial shot like this is add the realistic style that's built into Lumion. And this is going to immediately load in effects layers that are necessary for the output that we're looking for. But as you can see, I start to add in a couple more effect layers. And these are just effects that I typically use whenever I use my renderings, but there's really no wrong or right effects to use. I think the more you play with them, the better you'll get a feel for the necessary layers that you need to add to your drawing. And once again, as you add new effects, you always need to make sure that you're rendering test shots, as I do here. And you can see it's already getting pretty close to what we're looking for. And from that test shot, I realized my context buildings were a little bit too transparent, so I just decided to make them solid white boxes. And now you can see me tinkering and playing around with the adjustment layers. Just like anything else, the more you use this, the better you'll understand what adjustments you need to make. And there are a ton of great tutorials that show you the actual specific adjustments to add. And like through this tutorial, you can look at the adjustments I have and you can add them to yours and see how it works. But every drawing is different, so you need to understand that. So because my rendering is kind of a late in the day, almost sunset scene, I wanted to see if adding light to some of my street lamps and my buildings added anything. And I actually don't think it did very much for the end result because I ended up brightening it up quite a bit. But nonetheless, I guess it's good to show my process for placing some of these lights. You can see I'm using this rectangular area light, and I'm just rotating it and creating an angle so that it looks like the light is coming up and bouncing off of that curved aluminum plate or whatever and onto the streets. A lot of the times when you're placing lights in Lumion, you don't necessarily place them how the light is in reality. Sometimes you kind of fake it. In this case, obviously, there wouldn't be an actual light source on this piece, but I'm kind of taking a shortcut. Instead of actually trying to make the light bounce off that plate, I'm manually placing that. That way I can get it to do exactly what I want. And now, because all of the lights or the lamps are essentially the same, once I get one placed the way I like it, I can just copy paste it to all my others, and it's actually fairly quick. So now I wanted to do a little bit more testing with my effects. So what you see me doing here, I created a new scene, the exact same view, and I just copied and pasted my effects from the original scene to this one, just so that I had that first scene saved, just in case I needed to go back. But now you can see I'm just like before, tinkering some effects, exporting renders when I can, just trying to get it nailed down to exactly the style that I want. Now, I went ahead and added some lights to the interior of my buildings. This is very, very simple. I didn't spend much time on this at all. I used the same rectangular area light, and then I increased the width and the length so that it filled up most of the space on the inside. And when I needed to, I just copied and pasted multiples of them so that it filled up the space. But this was just in order to create some sort of light that was being emitted from some of the glass of the building. Here you can see another strategy where you make that area light perpendicular with the wall, so that you really get that directional light that looks like it's coming from the inside out. So now that we have all of our lighting and materials set up, the next most important thing that we need to add is all the entourage and vegetation. So this is really what's going to bring our rendering to life. So Lumion has a really great library of trees, people, cars, pretty much anything you can think of. So really, it's just a matter of figuring out what objects work best for your scene. But once you get the library or hang of the library and understand what you want to put in, placing them is actually really, really easy. The biggest thing when you're placing trees like this is just to make sure that you don't make everything too uniform. And Lumion has some really great ways to randomize rotation, scale, just to make it look like everything is just random enough so that it doesn't look like it was computerized. Here you can see I'm using the array tool. So this allows you to click 2 different points, and between those points it makes an array of objects. And then within the array you can change the number of items, the items that are actually in the array, the direction, and then a few other options. And that's just going to be a really, really quick way to place a large amount of objects. And combining that with holding down Alt while you move objects to copy and paste them is just a quick way to fill up your scene with objects without having to place everything one by one. So here I'm using that same technique. As you can see, I'm switching out the tree that I used at first for this lemon tree. And once I get that first row down, I just use the hold down Alt and move copy paste tool. And then I select all of the trees after I get them where I want. And then I just randomize their rotation. Now, I wanted to show that there was actually some sort of three-dimensional crop that was growing in these gardens. So I actually literally just used this like corn stalk that's in Lumion, and using the exact same strategy as placing the other trees, I did that array command, and then just copy pasted the lines, and then selected everything and then randomized their rotation, and then just very simply copy and pasted from garden bed to garden bed. And very, very quickly I had I added some realism to these gardens. So I wanted to add a line of trees that kind of went around the perimeter of this fence. So using the array tool, if you click your second point and then hold down Control, it allows you to extend to a third point. And you can do this obviously as many times as you need. So now you have this polyline of sorts that you can actually, if you select the nodes, you can drag them and adjust them to where you want. And now, just like before, I can select the tree I want, the number of items, the spacing, etc., so that I get the correct amount of trees around that fence. So now I just want to do a quick test render to see how my vegetation is starting to look. And you can see this is getting really close to what we're looking for the end result. So now I'm placing trees just kind of on the perimeter of my site and along the streets of the um, immediate context. And you can see this is a very quick process because I'm using that array tool, and once you use it or set up the settings once, it'll remember your settings. So all you have to do is click point to point and then copy paste or whatever combination you feel most comfortable with, and you'll quickly populate the scene that's necessary for your render. So now I have all of my vegetation in. I want to go ahead and add some cars just to give the streets a little bit more life. So to do this, up in my top left-hand corner, I've already done this a couple times in this tutorial, but I'm adding a new layer. And I'll just select that layer, and then I'll choose my place tool, and I'll choose the cars, or my, I guess, transportation, whatever vehicles. And you have everything from boats to bicycles in here. But we'll use the exact same strategy as placing the trees. I'll do that array command. I'll select the cars that I want to be on it. And as you can see, when I select a new car, if I click that plus sign, it allows me to add that variation to the array. And usually what I like to do when placing something like cars is it's always good to place more than what you actually need, and then to just come back in and do a pass and delete or just randomly delete some to lighten up the load, because obviously like we don't want it to like be too distracting and have too much traffic. It's really just to give the drawing a sense of scale, and once again, give the streets a little bit more life other than just the trees and lights. So the last thing that I want to add is my entourage, my people. To do this, I want to place them along the sidewalks. There's a couple areas that I want more of a cluster of people, so it looks like there's some kind of event. I want them to look like they're coming in and out of my buildings. So it's just a matter of composing them. You can use the exact same strategy that we used for placing the cars and trees. You can see I'm creating an array of people, and I'm just adding a wide variety of different types so that you don't see too much duplication. And once again, because we're doing this aerial drawing, we don't have to worry as much about the composition of the people and like which direction they're facing and stuff like that, because we're going to be so far zoomed out. Really, you're only going to be able to see their silhouettes and their massing. But with that being said, you still want to give some thought into like where you place them and how you place them. This array tool is actually also good for like clusters of people, because you can adjust the offset of the line. So you can actually place a line that's not very long, but have a very wide offset, and it gives that effect of more of a crowd in a dense area rather than a long line of people walking along the sidewalk. And then you can see I'm just quickly like placing clusters of people, copy pasting them just to really populate some of these areas that I have like these tents, so that it looks like there's some sort of event going on. So once I have my people placed, I think I'm about ready for my final render. Here you can actually see all the settings that I ended up using. So I'll do one final desktop 1080p test render. So this looks really great. I can tell that this is a great base to take into Photoshop. And all I need to do is make a few tweaks to the adjustments, and we'll have a really good image. I think right before I export my final renders, I just wanted to make a quick adjustment to some of the concrete in my context. So now I'm ready to export my final renders. To do this, Lumion allows you to choose additional outputs. So for this aerial rendering, I just want to do a reflection map and a lighting map. This is going to give us 2 more layers to use in Photoshop, just to bump up some of the contrast of the lighting, and also the reflections. I'll show you once we get there. One last export I want to do though is in outlines. So I can add the layer effect called outlines, and I can bump up the outline density, and then I can bump up the color variation. And this is going to essentially give me a black and white line drawing. If I export at the same resolution, I'll be able to overlay it in Photoshop and use the lines to actually give a little bit more detail to some of my buildings. So now we can open up all of our render passes in Photoshop. And then the first thing you want to do is crop out that Lumion watermark in the bottom right-hand corner. If you're using the student version of Lumion, that's going to be there no matter what. So you just have to take that into account when you're exporting your render so that you know that you're going to be able to crop that out. It's no big deal. And now you just adjust the settings on your additional outputs, such as changing them to multiply or screen to get rid of either the white or the black space in those outputs. And then you can adjust the opacity and see what works best for your drawing. Nonetheless, I think those the reflection and lighting exports depends on your drawing. Sometimes they make a big difference. Sometimes it's very subtle, but I think you should always have them just in case. So now I'm going to go to make a duplicate of my base render. And with that new layer selected, I'm going to do filter, camera raw filter. And this is the one thing that you should take away from this Photoshop exercise. The camera raw filter is, in my opinion, like the hands down the best way to add adjustments to your rendering. As you can see, you have the clarity option. You can play with the blacks, whites, highlights, shadows. And I've just really found that using this versus just typical adjustment layers in Photoshop, this really helps bring out some of the effects in Lumion that aren't necessarily going to be extracted from the base render. So you can play with color temperature. There's actually pretty advanced settings in here that I don't really get into, but obviously when you're doing your stuff, you can take a look at them and see if any of these help with your rendering. Something that I do like to add is in the effects tab. You can add a slight vignette, and I think that's something that kind of really starts to frame your drawing. And now you can see what this is starting to pan out to look like. So once I get that camera raw layer, I usually like to duplicate it and then add a blur layer. So to do this, I just, on that new layer, add a Gaussian blur, and then I apply a layer mask, and then with a feathered paintbrush, I'll paint over the part of my project that I don't want to be blurry. And then you can see it kind of adds that subtle blur to some of my contexts. And I forgot to mention it, but because I exported the outlines from Lumion, you can see on my contexts, instead of them just being white masses, they actually have outlines, which really helps to define those buildings. So something I really wanted to do in my rendering was show that I have these ground lights that kind of go along the perimeter of all my paths. And I wasn't able to get it to export exactly how I wanted from Lumion. So what I'm doing is just photoshopping in this lens flare over my lights. This is just a really quick exercise. It's one of those small things that I had in the back of my mind. I really wanted to show it, so I just did it here by literally using a lens flare off of Google Images, setting it to screen, and then adjusting the opacity so it's not too bright. Now I'm going to add some clouds to frame my aerial perspective even more. I'm just using this image off of Google Images, and I'll set it to screen and I'll scale it up a little bit. And now I'm pretty much going to stick it on the periphery of my drawing, so all the corners, kind of over my context. This is a good way to not necessarily cover your context, but really start to put all of your focus and attention on your project. And you can adjust the opacity settings to whatever you think looks best. And the last thing I want to add is a photo filter adjustment layer. And this is A really cool last step in Photoshop for just really starting to stylize your render. If you want it to feel warmer, cooler, a specific color tone, this photo filter adjustment layer is going to allow you to do that very quickly. And you'll also find that this adjustment layer is also good for keeping a consistent style between all of your renderings. So if you're going to do a ground perspective next, you could use the same photo filter that you used for the aerial, and you'll get that bridge between the two drawings, which is really nice. So now we can look at that first output that we exported from Lumion and compare it to our final rendering that we have here that we just exported from Photoshop. And you can see this is a very high resolution image. Didn't take us too much time to produce, and it could really be the centerpiece for a presentation. So now you can compare this final rendering to one of the line drawings that we did, and try to understand the two different levels of detail that need to be put in to these two different drawing types. But overall, I really hope this video helps you out for understanding how to use Lumion, SketchUp, and Photoshop to make a perspective aerial rendering. And thanks.